Then I describe after that the assessment techniques that I use, that is, what were the instruments and methodology that I use. I discuss risk assessment. I say here, findings from the assessment indicate the following risk, high, moderate, or low for job-relevant deficiencies in the required psychological competencies. Candidates with a high risk rating on one or more dimensions do not meet qualification standards. Candidates with one or more moderate risk ratings meet qualification standards but reveal an elevated potential for performance problems that may be lowered through training experience and or supervision. Now there's a certification of rating that contains only that first sheet but none of the other stuff. That's the one that goes into the personnel file. Some agencies don't want a narrative report at all. Portland Police Bureau, for example, wants no narrative report. Their law office has said, just give us
yay or nay.
Yay or nay.
Yes.
We don't want a report, and that's fine. I still produce I still complete what you see here. So here I have the 10 dimensions for post-psychological, not the background, not the same pre-op, or not the background dimensions, but the psychological dimensions. And I summarize what those items are for the reader, and then I rate as low, moderate, or high risk. For this particular person, I rate it as high risk for assertiveness and persuasiveness, high risk under social competence, and those were the bases for my opinion. So here's what I wrote about this person. Well, that's really nice.
I didn't do it.
Valerie.
Okay, can you read that?
Yeah. No, he's there.
No. Okay. All right. So what it says is, Mr. Doe's responses to personality testing correspond with markedly poor social skills and socio-perceptual abilities. That is, the ability to accurately perceive, interpret, and anticipate behavior in others. Throughout the initial period of my clinical interview with Mr. Doe, he presented himself in a very stoic, expressionless, and unpleasant way. Despite my efforts to break the ice, he persisted unabated in this manner. For example, when I asked Mr. Doe why he wanted to be a police officer, a question designed solely to facilitate the interview, not to judge the quality of his motives, he replied, "I don't know," in a monotone voice. When I pressed for a more substantive response, he answered, "Just everyday challenges, I guess, working outside." Nothing I did or said resulted in Mr. Doe being any more forthcoming and open. He stated that he tends to be quiet, stoic, and minimally responsive to others except when he's in control, as when he's working as a firefighter or paramedic and dealing with citizens. Rather than merely quiet and stoic, however, I found his behavior passive-aggressive. It was clear that he did not like being here in this evaluation, and his response to it was to make it as unpleasant for me as he felt it was for him. In a similar vein, he left blank a question on a history form that asked him to list all traumatic events he's been exposed to in his life. He was given an approximately 3 by 7-inch space in which to write his response. He explained that he left it blank because he had too many to list. When I asked him to write as many as he could in the space available, he listed only 4 and left more than half of the space available for more. When asked again to list all he could think of, he said that was it.
What a pleasant fellow.
Yeah, he's a really pleasant fellow. Okay, so let's see what else. In a variety of ways, evidence of Mr. Doe's deficient interpersonal competency can be found in the references reported in the background investigation. For example, one of his supervisors cited his primary weakness as being his failure to open up more. A coworker cited his principal fault as his bluntness. He doesn't sugarcoat things. If he doesn't like something or someone, he would say it. Although this was minimized by noting that, quote, he is always professional about it, unquote, and, quote, it never got in the way of work or made things uncomfortable, unquote, it is hard to imagine that this trait does not, in fact, reduce effectiveness in a job that requires considerable diplomacy, interpersonal sophistication, mediation skill, and communication ability. Another coworker described him as sarcastic, another noted that he tells it like it is. In the course of the assessment, Mr. Doe was asked whether he makes jokes or negative comments at work about women, minorities, or other protected groups, one of the questions in Mike's IQ. He He replied that he does, and he defends his doing so by noting that, quote, everybody does it. As an example of the kinds of comments or jokes he makes, he said, quote, there's a guy I work with who's actually from Africa and we'll make jokes about him all the time. He exhibited no appreciation of the legal liability associated with such conduct, not to mention the ethical and interpersonal implications. Mr. Doe's responses to personality testing produced valid profiles that correspond with a markedly elevated risk of counterproductive interpersonal behavior of precisely the type demonstrated both in the interview and in the candidate's occupational background. CPI scores at or below T equals 39, police applicant norms on scales DO, SY, SP, SA, IN, EM, RE, and WB, as well as an SO scale score of T equals 69. That's the, I'm doing it because everybody does it, piece. Support this finding, as do PAI scores of T equals 42 on dominance, police incumbent norms, and T equals 32 on the WARM scale. There are certainly a wide range of interpersonal styles that can be effective in law enforcement, and it is by no means necessary that all police officers be engaging, warm, and garrulous. At a minimum, however, they must be sufficiently capable of feigning tolerance and politeness, and Mr. Doe failed to engage in even the slightest efforts in this direction. Instead, his passive-aggressive behavior expressed an overt hostility that betrayed an even broader array of interpersonal insensitivities that in the aggregate rendered him psychologically unqualified to carry out the duties of a police officer in the diverse environment of an urban police agency. Therefore, in consideration of the full range of assessment information available to me at this time, I conclude that Mr. Doe fails to meet the minimum standards for psychological qualification as a police officer with Acme Police Department.
And you're gonna hear from him.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
So he's a bar lateral, I mean, he's a fireman who wants to be a police officer? Is that what I'm reading?
Is he what?
That
Fireman.
Fireman?
He's a fireman who wanted to become a police officer. How often does that happen?
No.
Probably not very often.
So in some circumstances, the agency would get this level of detail, and others, they would just get a cover sheet with the decision.
That's correct, depending upon what the agency wants. The agency decides the amount of information they get. Now, if the candidate is qualified, they don't get this detail. I'm not giving them information that is going to just confuse the picture for them, or that may result in an unanticipated negative outcome, like rescinding an offer for a person who's fully deserving of it. They're qualified, they're qualified. But
Not coming to dinner.
if they're qualified, but there are some considerations involving some discrepancies between what the background reports and what the candidate reported to me that I can't resolve, I'll include that in the report so that the agency knows to decide whether there's an integrity issue. I can't sort it out. But if they're unqualified, this becomes my, well, it becomes a justification, but I'm not just writing to them. I'm really not writing to the agency at all.
You're writing to court.
I'm writing to the court. That's correct. I'm writing to you. I'm writing to the jury of my peers. So I'm including in my report the full underpinnings of my evaluation, and that includes giving a flavor of how this all played out. And if I had a consultation with the agency in which I laid out these concerns with them to see the extent of their own risk tolerance, and they said, no, that's not behavior we feel that we can handle, I'm going to include that discussion in my report as well. So it's all the information that plays a role in my decision is going to be a part of that narrative for an unqualified applicant. For a qualified applicant, it's very short, very sweet. Anybody else follow a similar approach to report preparation? Herb, I know you do.
We don't write anything that's favorable. We just use the format.
For a qualified candidate.
Right. Only unqualified or if you have a valid test.
All right, so Herb in Honolulu PD uses the same report format that I use. And if it's qualified, the candidate's qualified, there's no narrative. If the candidate is unqualified, you do something similar. Then there's a justification. Okay? Yes, Dorothy?
So does that mean you wouldn't ever identify a candidate that you thought was exceptionally strong?
No, you wouldn't.
Do I ever? Yeah, I think I have. I think I've said that there's some unusual features that are pretty impressive.
Hey, what was that question?
I'm sorry. The question was, do I ever comment on a person that was particularly strong? And the answer is yes, I have done that. There are times you get a really poised and impressive 22-year-old. That's just remarkable, and you can't help but comment on it. Now, perhaps it's, it's
Cousin or something?
yeah, cousin. I mean, there's really no justification except that it's so unusual and in some ways seems compelling to note it. But I think it's perfectly appropriate to leave out as well. Here in the,
She was first.
Okay, go ahead.
One of the things I will sometimes do in clearing someone, and this comes from years of being battered by the chiefs of, I can make those decisions, is to say that there's no psychologically disqualifying factors, but this person may be a supervision problem, and I give examples that they challenge authority, whatever, it doesn't rise to the
Right.
this. And I know he's the nephew of the councilman, and so I say that it's an administrative, not a psychological.
No, I understand. If I read it, the observation is that that she'll write into the narrative that even though the person meets the qualification standards, there's still some bases for concern about the person's performance. And I agree, that's what a moderate risk is. If they're low risk on every dimension, and many of them are, the narrative says virtually
Good to
nothing.
go.
It's by and large a cut and paste.
Okay,
Yes.
but I'm a little confused, because it sounded like if the person passes, you said you don't write a narrative, but here.
No, I write a narrative.
You write a narrative?
I write a narrative. Herb does not.
Okay,
Now, except unless it's Portland Police Bureau or some other agencies that have told me they want
Don't.
no narrative report.
Right.
So they just get a certification rating at
I've
that
had
point.
agencies who absolutely don't want to report if the person clears.
So-
Because they don't want anybody, their fear is somebody's gonna look back later and say, you said, and we still hired him.
Yeah, so that's, the observation for San Diego was that she has agencies that don't want any commentary or narrative if the person is qualified for fear that it may become
Negligent hiring.
it can become material in the plaintiff may get a hold of it later, and it can become fodder for either negligent hiring or some other liability theory. Mike?
We had one agency that said, send us the decision in writing, and then they sent it back to us. They didn't want to keep it in their files
Yeah.
at all.
So
We don't-
here's an agency they want to see it, but then they want it returned. Okay,